voting, drug policy, income inequality, and education. The issues of the 1960s civil rights movement are as vital today as they were in the era of Martin Luther King. How far has America progressed, and what needs to happen for the country to embody for everyone the promise of its founding? Dr. David Covin, author and political scientist and professor emeritus at Sacramento State, and civil rights activist and executive director of MLK 365, Samuel Starks, join us next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Dr. Covin, what is the most important civil rights issue facing America today?
That's a complex question which requires a complex answer, so I'll begin with a simple one. I think one of the major things that black people who are engaged politically should look at and should try to develop some way of dealing with is the NRA.
The NRA?
The NRA. If you look at what's going on, say in Chicago, with the number of killings, and these are killings where people are killing each other deliberately, and some of it's accidental. They missed and they hit the wrong person. But the number of killings, I think it's over 600 right now for this year in Chicago. They can only be done with guns. I grew up in that area. I was like most kids. I palled around with some, didn't pal around with others. We got into fights. But when people fought, it was either with their hands, their feet, or at worst, they had a knife or a razor. And people got hurt. But little kids on the 9th floor weren't getting killed. And very few of those guys who got into fights were getting killed. A lot of that has to do with the availability of guns. If we'd had guns, we probably would have been killing each other too. But we didn't have them. And people didn't die. And people who got in fights stayed in school. They weren't sent to jail. They weren't killing people. They weren't terrorizing neighborhoods. And the center of that, and U.S. population even looks at guns as something that shouldn't be available to everybody, and despite the Second Amendment. And guns shouldn't be something that are used by children.
But as a civil rights issue, Sam, you run an organization that looks at civil rights on an ongoing basis. Mm-hmm. Gun control as a civil rights issue, how do you respond?
Well, I think what David, Professor Covin said is partially right. I think when you're talking about one group sees guns as a kind of freedom and as a legacy, and that without control sometimes impinges upon the freedoms and rights of others. There is that income issue as well. But put to me, civil rights, I think of, especially these days, you have to think of mass incarceration on one hand, misapplication of education, public education specifically, on the other. And between those two bookends, you have, I think, the civil rights, the big faux pas in civil rights is our inability to really get it right for the least of these. And I think that will remain until we fix it.
Why can't we get it right for the least of these?
Well, I think we can't get it right. The least of these means that everyone else benefits. The least of these means that it's right for the middle class. The least of these means that it's right for women, and especially the sons and daughters of of the enslaved. That is really at the heart, that we have to really kind of take the messages and values of those who fought and died in the struggle and really find an application today, one that leads to the same things that little white boys and little white girls, as Dr. King would say, holding hands with little black girls. We have to find the way to make that a reality. And I think, based on this, our inability to really look at institutional problems in a very real way and make those big changes, it still leaves the dream for very many out. Many of us still out in the cold.
Dr. Covin, a major part of your body of work is an analysis of institutions. When it comes to meeting the promise of Dr. King's dream and that of the founding of this country, what institutionally has to change in order to unlock what is holding us back?
I don't know what has to change institutionally. If you look at the black population, for example, because that's the center of this particular focus, if you look at the black population has a responsibility to itself. And in many ways, it's fulfilling that responsibility. But
How so?
First of all, it's very well organized. Black women are probably the most well organized group of people in the entire country.
Really?
Yes. Black women outvote everybody else. They're very highly organized. Let's look at how this is not seen in general. If I say, for example, the National Council of Negro Women, does that bring anything to mind right away?
Mrs. McLeod Bethune, maybe?
What about the Sweet Potato Festival?
Didn't make the connection.
The Sweet Potato Festival goes on every year. It's run by the National Council for Negro Women, and they use it locally to develop resources that they distribute to the community. What about MLK 365? Heard of that?
Some group that pretends to be something.
What about SAC Hub? What about the Women's Civic Improvement Club?
Where's this going?
Where this is going is these are all institutions founded and operated by black people who address black needs. This is entirely under the radar screen for most of the country. They don't know it's there. These names don't mean anything to them. They have no understanding of how the black community marshals its resources and how it's able to do what it is able to do. Take when Obama ran for the presidency. He was able to do that in large part, in very large part, because of the intense organization, the detailed, comprehensive organization of black people in this country. So black people make a lot of mistakes. Black organizations make a lot of mistakes. Nobody else does. So of course we have shortcomings. Of course we have failings. But the strength of black organizational commitment and development is extraordinary.
So that being the case, given the indices that we just talked about in terms of things that are affecting that community and its relationship to the civil rights movement, why hasn't more progress been made, despite this extraordinary organization?
Because of the environment in which we're operating. I mean, the President of the United States is a good example of that.
Explain what you mean by that.
when the leader of the free world can classify people who are vandals, really, along with people who are struggling for their rights, as, oh, there are some nice people among them, the vandals. They're good people. And when that kind of orientation can be supported by a significant portion of the United States population, that's a deeply entrenched set of circumstances that even the most effective organizations in the world are not going to do anything about unless there is some change from the inside, unless there is some change from the other side. Black people can be as effective as it is possible for them to be, but as 13% of the national population, they're not going to be able to do it unless something starts to happen from those who are really, look, most black people still live in the South. The South is red when you look at red states and blue states. So unless that equation can be changed so that the place where most black people in the country live is the place where the most racist people dominate the state, the government, unless that kind of change takes place, we're going to have to rely very heavily on ourselves to keep ourselves stable and to make whatever kinds of progress we can.
Sam, when Dr. Covin talks about relying on ourselves, and his discourse is focused specifically on black people, but civil rights in the 60s was focused on the plight of black Americans. But today, there's a much broader population that feels ownership and agency in all of these issues. How has the civil rights movement changed to incorporate all of the other issues and people that have a direct stake in opportunity and freedom in this country?
Well, I think when you think of civil rights, people have embraced many cultures have, American cultures have embraced civil rights for themselves. And indeed, it has its origins, many of those origins in the African American experience, but we've come a long ways since Dr. King, and from the women's movement to the LGBT movement to Latino Hispanic movement. You have individuals who are really kind of, and this younger generation, a generation might we add that is very locked into equity, that's locked into non-bullying, that grew up 8 years of their lives with a black president. They're very locked into this notion that this thing called civil rights is just, they might not understand civil rights, but what they understand is fairness and equality, and everybody should be treated right. And I'm okay with that. I think I'm okay with that. That's a good starting point. If we could deal with that, and I think as this younger generation matures, as the millennials are replaced, I think by Y, I think, is that the next group after the millennials? As they're replaced, the pushback that we're feeling, the pushback that currently President Trump is feeling, might not necessarily be coming 100% from the civil rights community. It's coming from the young kids. It's coming from kids who might grow up in all brown or all white communities and are saying it's just not right. So I think we have to be careful when we think about civil rights, not to kind of lock groups of people out. That's why when we have people walk, we just say, hey, let's build understanding through engagement. And I think by and large,
You did an interesting thing this year in that your shirts promoted some sort of connection between people that marched. Explain that to us.
Well, basically, we had 3 different color shirts that said the same thing. One shirt was the word walk was in bolded in white, the middle shirt with was emboldened in white, and the third shirt, a different color, the me was emboldened with white. And it read, "To understand why I matter." And so that was the context that we sent the 30,000 walkers out. And we said, you know, honoring Dr. King means putting his ideas and values into practice. And so it's us kind of speaking, channeling, visioning to that next generation. That's what they're into. They got it. We sat and we watched. And I would say 2 to 3 years from now, it's going to all be about inviting someone, reaching outside of my of the structures that the society has
My
put.
ethnic group, my
Of
neighborhood,
course.
whatever.
And engaging. And not just one day, but 365 days. That's the exciting thing. And when that happens, when those folks become leaders, when they become the leaders in our society, I think what we're going to see is some real change. But we have to begin to channel it. And I don't want us to be caught by the words of old, the old words. Civil rights is a great word, but young people understand social justice. And for them, that social justice notion is a word that's more empowering than, I would think, than civil rights.
Not to be contrary, just for
Please.
the sake of being contrary, you strike a really hopeful note, but there was a recent poll by NBC News Wall Street Journal that said that 70% of Americans think that race relations, and race being a big word, okay, encompassing a whole lot of groups, is worse than ever in this era. You hear the hope that Sam talks about, particularly with the young people, but then you get a statistic like that. How do those two things correlate?
I read recently a statement that Jesse Jackson made a while ago, and it was that progress is not inherited. Progress is not inherited. In other words, if progress is going to be sustained, people have to sustain it. That's why struggle continues to be important, because unless people are engaged, with 70% of the population saying that race relations are worse than ever, if people aren't engaged, it's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to tumble down out of the sky. People have to continue to work for it. If we want progress this year, if we want progress next year, we have to be at the forefront of working for progress.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the questions earlier have to be looked at from the perspective of people who are trying to wrestle with these questions. That is, how do you get done what Sam is getting done? How do you change that picture so that race relations are not worse than ever? What are the vehicles for doing that? And people have to think about that. People have to be engaged with it. And it takes time. It takes time from individuals. It takes time from organizations. It takes time in terms of time. It can't be done quickly, but progress can be made if we try to make it, but it is not inherited.
So that brings me to you as an observer of the social scene in Sacramento, as a professor since when?
1970.
1970. How is Sacramento different today from a civil rights perspective, and how is it still the same?
It's different. Let me put it this way in terms of the difference. It's different in the sense that in 1970, there was one black person on the Sacramento City Council, just recently elected. I think elected in 1969. Right now, there are 3 black people on the Sacramento City Council out of a council of 9. During the mayorship of Kevin Johnson, there were 4 black people on a 5-member black city council. When I talk about this at political science conferences around the country, people are stunned. They can't believe it. They think it's impossible. But this situation of having 3 or 4 black people on the Sacramento City Council has been going on for about a decade. Black leadership, black engagement is different here from what it is in many places. And part of it can't really be accounted for in any clear way. If you look at something like Florence, Italy, in the Renaissance, for example. Why Florence? Who knows? The same sort of thing can be said about other places and other times. Sometimes it's unexplainable. The right people get together at the right time, and the right kind of culture, political culture, social culture, is present. I was talking earlier about black organizations. A lot of these black organizations are artistic organizations, drama, music, dance, and there has to be a critical mass of people who are engaged in these kinds of ways to make the kind of representation one sees at the city level in Sacramento possible.
And how is Sacramento the same as it was?
It's the same in the sense that black people are still on the bottom. If you look at the population at large in terms of income, test scores in schools, in terms of arrests, in terms of death by violence, black people are on the bottom. They were then, they are now. If you look in terms of the distribution of the population, black people tend to be centered in certain areas. They're not evenly spread throughout the county. And other populations tend to be similarly situated.
So when I hear that observation, it actually makes one think that not much progress has been made.
Well, I happen to think, and depending on who you talk to and when, I can't plant a field in despair, thinking that what I sow is not going to one day grow. So I'm very optimistic. I realize that attitudes may change, but institutions are the things that we really need to put our focus on. And we really do need to look at what we can do collectively, not just black people, but as a society, to make it right for everyone in our society. Making it right for everyone means that we're going to look at the descendants of the masters and the descendants of the enslaved equally. And we're going to figure out where we can go and how do we get there. So to your point about Sacramento. Sacramento is every city USA. I think that, someone said a tree is known by its fruits. You still see disproportionality in terms of mass incarceration. You see, even in Sacramento, you see young black kids not graduating, 50% in one school district, another school district, 60% not passing, not graduating. And this is a whole school district. So when we look at progress, we can look at the positive side, but we also have to come to grips with these very salient questions as to why aren't people of color.
So tell me, in a few words, what makes you optimistic for the future?
Hope. Hope. That I can get up, that I see that hope in the eyes of young people of all different backgrounds, cultures, and religions. If you walked on that day, you saw the hope, and you still see it to this day. Whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's Occupy, there's hope. There's people out there who are working to make America great again. And I think that's the word.
All right. And that's our show. Thanks to our guests and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE. All right, just...
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at KVIE.